The sun is setting over ancient Babylon. Its sacred ziggurat rises like a stone mountain against the amber sky, casting a long shadow across the Euphrates. But the banners flying are not Babylonian, not Sumerian. They bear the mark of a foreign dynasty, one few today even recognize. A bronze figurine of a horse glints on a temple altar. Then stillness. No voices, no chants, only the wind brushing over a forgotten name. They weren't born of the fertile rivers. They didn't speak the language of the old gods. And yet, for almost 400 years, longer than any native line, the Kassites ruled Babylon. Generations rose and fell under their watch. And yet, we barely remember them. Who were they? Raiders from the mountains or guardians of empire? They came from the rugged Zagros, far from the heartlands of Mesopotamia. Strangers riding into the cradle of civilization, and somehow they stayed. Not as conquerors in passing, but as stewards of one of history's greatest cities. And then, just as quietly as they arrived, they disappeared. No grand collapse, no heroic downfall, just silence. Why did the world forget them? How did they rise from obscurity to rule the city of Hammurabi and vanish into the mist of history? This is their story. A tale of migration, adaptation, and an empire that lasted centuries, only to leave behind barely a whisper. Welcome to Age of Past. The year is 1595 BCE. Babylon, the jewel of Mesopotamia, lies broken. Not by rebellion, not by plague, but by something stranger. A lightning strike from the north. A foreign force no one expected and no one could stop. The Hittites, charioteers from the highlands of Anatolia. They swept in, sacked the city, stole the statue of Marduk, Babylon's chief god, and then disappeared. They didn't stay. They didn't conquer. They left the city leaderless. Just rubble, smoke, and silence. The empire that Hammurabi built was gone in a single blow. The bureaucrats, scattered. The priests, confused. The people, afraid. Babylon wasn't just a city. It was the city. The center of order in a fragile world. And now that center had collapsed. The vacuum it left was dangerous. To the east, Elam watched hungrily. To the north, Assyria began to stir. And within the old Babylonian borders, fragments of Hammurabi's realm turned into rival city-states, each vying for power, each remembering the glory days with growing bitterness. Into this chaos came no heroes, no chosen ones, no ancient bloodline rising from the ashes. Instead came the Kassites, strangers, outsiders, mountain folk from the Zagros, beyond the Fertile Crescent. They didn't roar into Babylon like the Hittites. They didn't flatten cities like the Elamites. They came in slowly, like mist rolling down a valley, like vines creeping up a broken wall. Quiet, steady, persistent. We don't know what they called themselves. We don't know what they believed. Their language was unlike anything else in the region, neither Semitic nor Sumerian. And what little writing they left behind remains mysterious. They had no founding myth, no epic tale of destiny, no charismatic leader carved into stone reliefs. But they had horses and patience. And in a region torn apart by ambition and memory, that was enough. At first, they likely served as mercenaries, horse warriors for hire. They offered something new on the battlefield: speed, mobility, and unpredictability. In a world dominated by foot soldiers and slow-moving supply lines, they were lightning. But they weren't just warriors, they were survivors. Rather than fight for dominance, they inserted themselves carefully into Babylonian life. They married local nobles, respected the gods of the land, learned Akkadian, the lingua franca of Mesopotamia. They didn't erase the past. They made themselves part of it. And slowly, the Kassites weren't outsiders anymore. They were rulers. without fanfare, without a bloody revolution, just time. They didn't burn temples, they restored them. They didn't impose new gods, they honored the old ones. They didn't tear down the bureaucracy, they adopted it. In a way, they understood Babylon better than the Babylonians, because they understood the idea of Babylon. It wasn't just a city, it was a system, and systems, once broken, don't need fire to be replaced. They need stability. The Kassites offered that, not with charisma, but with consistency. They ruled not as kings by blood, but as caretakers of something ancient, fragile, and sacred. They brought new elements, of course. Kassite nobility had its own customs, its own symbols. The image of the horse became central, often seen in bronze figurines placed in temples and tombs. And though their language remains elusive, they introduced new administrative terms into Babylonian society, like Dur-Kurigalzu, a Kassite royal name that would later become the title of kings. They also brought a new kind of kingship, less about divine claims, more about endurance. They didn't promise a golden age, they promised not to fall apart. And in a world still recovering from sudden ruin, that promise meant everything. Imagine a house abandoned after a storm. Walls cracked, roof torn off. The Kassites didn't build a new house. They patched the walls, repaired the roof, swept the floors, and then stayed. Longer than anyone else, 4 centuries. Through droughts, invasions, and change. But why aren't they talked about as much? Why does a dynasty that ruled longer than the Amorites, the Akkadians, or even the Assyrians barely earn a footnote? How does an empire built not on fire and conquest, but on restoration and calm, fade from memory? Perhaps it's because we look for drama. We remember the wars, the conquerors, the collapses. But the Kassites weren't that. They were the in-between, the caretakers, the ones who stepped in when no one else could. And in doing so, they became kings. Next, we'll follow their journey from opportunists to temple builders, from strange accents and foreign horses, to the golden palaces of Babylon itself. They ruled not with swords drawn, but with hands steady on the reins. The Kassites, these mountain-born horsemen, had taken Babylon not in a blaze of glory, but through something rarer in history: patience. And now, having claimed the heart of Mesopotamia, they did something unexpected. They didn't build an empire of terror. They built one of trust. No grand proclamations. No towering statues of warrior kings crushing enemies beneath their feet. Instead, they focused on something far more difficult: stability. For over 400 years, the Kassites governed Babylon, and they did it with a kind of quiet confidence that other kingdoms rarely mastered. At the center of this subtle empire stood a city of their own making, Dur-Kurigalzu. Named after one of their great kings, this city rose from the plains west of Babylon, near what we now call Baghdad. It wasn't just a fortress, it was a statement. The Kassites didn't erase the old world, they built alongside it. Dur-Kurigalzu was their answer to the question of legitimacy: a new capital, grand yet grounded, with ziggurats towering toward the heavens, canals feeding farmlands, and temples rebuilt stone by stone. This was no passing occupation. It was home. The great ziggurat of Dur-Kurigalzu still stands in ruins today, weathered, forgotten, but immense. Its bricks once held the prayers of kings who claimed no divine blood, only divine duty. Unlike the Assyrians to the north, who carved their victories into walls with chilling detail, or the Egyptians to the west, who turned pharaohs into gods, the Kassites chose a different path. They embraced the scribes. They adopted cuneiform, the language of law, myth, and memory in Babylon, and ensured it lived on. Their schools copied texts from centuries past, preserving stories, rituals, and records that might have vanished in the post-collapse chaos. They didn't just learn Babylonian ways, they became part of them. They worshipped Marduk, the city's chief god, repaired the Esagila temple, Marduk's sanctuary, honored the seasonal festivals, the rites of kingship, the rituals of the land. And yet, they never vanished into the crowd. If you look closely at their seals, their names, their royal inscriptions, you see something different. Not Babylonian, not Sumerian, not Akkadian, Kassite. A culture that remained quiet but never silent. Their gods, like Shukamuna and Shumalia, still appeared alongside Marduk. Their rituals had flavors not found in the older traditions. Their elite names often carried the old mountain cadences, even as they ruled a lowland empire. It was a balance few could maintain, integration without erasure. They sent letters, diplomatic ones, to Egypt, to Hatti, to Mitanni. These were not vassals groveling for favor. These were kings writing to kings. And we have the proof. The Amarna letters, clay tablets found in Egypt, show Kassite kings speaking as equals to Pharaoh. They exchanged gifts, horses, precious stones, daughters. Royal marriages became bridges between worlds. Kassite princesses walked palace halls in Thebes. Egyptian trinkets were buried in Babylonian tombs. They didn't wield power through spectacle. They wielded it through consistency. And perhaps that's why we struggle to remember them. They didn't expand like Assyria, didn't build tombs like Egypt, didn't glorify themselves in epic battles or divine births. They built roads, dug canals, tamed rivers, filled granaries, trained scribes, balanced temples and taxes. They governed. Their empire didn't stretch far, but it held fast. Think of them as the quiet gears of a well-oiled machine, turning behind the scenes, never drawing attention, but keeping everything moving. And for centuries, it worked. There were no great civil wars, no waves of rebellion, no temples burning in rage. Babylon was peaceful, its people prosperous, its gods respected. While other kingdoms rose and fell in the flames of ambition, the Kassites endured. And yet, when you flip through history books, when you look for their names in the grand narratives of ancient glory, they're barely there. Why? Because they didn't shout, they whispered. And in the noise of war, of conquest, of fallen towers and bloody crowns, whispers are often lost. But not here. And what we hear is remarkable. The Kassites, these horse kings of Babylon, redefined what it meant to rule. Not through violence, not through divinity, but through presence, through patience, through peace. A quiet empire, built not on spectacle, but on time. And yet, even the most stable kingdoms must one day face the storm. And in the centuries to come, the world around them would change, fast, violently, and without mercy. Could they hold on? Or had their silence become their weakness? That's the question we now face. If you stood in Kassite Babylon, you wouldn't see much shouting. No towering stone panels of kings trampling enemies. No great walls etched with lines of divine descent. No heroic inscriptions of battles won and lands seized. That silence wasn't accidental. It was a choice. Most ancient empires were loud. The Hittites filled their archives with boasts, lists of captured cities, long campaigns, kings cowed into submission. The Assyrians were even louder, carving terrifying scenes into their palaces. Men impaled, cities burning, kings begging for mercy. Even Hammurabi, centuries before, made sure his laws were carved on a massive basalt stele. On top of it, he stands face to face with the god Shamash, receiving divine authority. It was about performance. Rule had to be justified. Power had to be seen. But the Kassites were different. We don't get manifestos from them. We get measurements. We don't get tales of conquest. We get coordinates. The bulk of Kassite inscriptions aren't about glory or victory. They're about farmland. And the medium? Not grand statues, not temple walls, but kuduru stones. These were boundary markers, legal records carved into durable stone. They listed who gave what land to whom, how it should be taxed, who could use it, and what gods watched over the agreement. In most cases, it wasn't a king claiming greatness, it was a king confirming a field. At first glance, it's underwhelming. Where's the grandeur? Where's the empire? But these modest stones, unimpressive to modern eyes, reveal something deeper. They show a kingdom not obsessed with expansion, but with administration. The Kassites weren't building a legacy of war. They were building a system that could outlast them. Every kuduru reflects an astonishing level of administrative coordination. Each one maps a web of royal grants, priestly entitlements, temple lands, and civic privileges. One stone might list 10 gods, 15 field measurements, 3 types of taxation, and a curse for any future official who tries to change it. They're less about ego and more about structure, and they weren't just functional, they were symbolic. At the top of many kuduru are carved symbols of gods, stars, animals, emblems. These weren't decorations, they were witnesses. Every transaction was made sacred. Every agreement carried weight beyond the human realm. To tamper with the boundary was to offend the divine. In a sense, the Kassites replaced the battlefield with the boundary line. They swapped conquest for contracts, and somehow that worked. So why this silence in their public voice? Was it humility? Maybe. Perhaps their mountain roots carried a different attitude toward power. Less theatrical, less performative. They may have seen rule not as a right to be flaunted, but as a responsibility to be managed. Or perhaps it was strategic. Spectacle invites scrutiny. A king who brags about conquest must deliver it again and again. A king who governs quietly can endure. And they did endure for nearly 400 years. Through droughts, shifting alliances, foreign pressures, still they stayed. There's another theory, elitism without performance. The Kassite elite may have felt no need to proclaim their rule in stone. Their authority came from stability. From the quiet fact that temples were funded, harvests came on time, and no one starved. In a world constantly bruised by chaos, that was enough. When compared to Hammurabi, the contrast is striking. Hammurabi immortalized law itself. He made it visible, legible, divine. The Kassites made law a daily function. Instead of inscribing a single code, they preserved systems, through scribes, through temples, through land management. You don't get sweeping declarations. You get continuity. It's not that they lacked vision, it's that their vision was boring, in the best way. They wanted a world that functioned, and they got it. This is why, despite the apparent absence of drama, their rule was deeply influential. Their record-keeping helped define how land was held, used, and taxed across southern Mesopotamia. They integrated priests, soldiers, and merchants into a system that minimized conflict and maximized predictability. It's no accident that many of their practices endured even after they were gone. Later dynasties borrowed from their land tenure models. Their city planning was imitated. Their balance between native tradition and foreign leadership became a blueprint for stability. And yet, despite all this, we barely remember them. Because when people govern well, history forgets. There's no chaos to record, no fire to dramatize, no rebellion to romanticize. What survives is administration, tables, weights, contracts, seals. And so the Kassites vanished, not in a storm, but in a spreadsheet. This wasn't an empire of heroes. It was an empire of managers. And while we don't build statues for those who balance the books, we live in the worlds they hold together. That's what the Kassites did. They held Babylon together, quietly, for longer than any who came before, and without ever needing to raise their voice. By the time the world reached 1200 BCE, something had changed. Not just in Babylon, but everywhere. The air was different, the balance unsettled. The great kingdoms of the Bronze Age, once stable, proud, eternal, began to crack, almost in unison. Trade routes dried up. Cities that had flourished for centuries now sent no grain, no letters, no tribute. Old alliances fractured, new enemies emerged, and the Kassites, so steady, so patient, found themselves standing on sand. To the north, Assyria was no longer a quiet neighbor. It had become a sharpened blade. Its kings were aggressive, expansionist, and loud. They glorified conquest, pushed borders southward, and eyed Babylon with growing hunger. To the east, Elam stirred restlessly. What had once been a rival was now becoming a predator. Elamite kings launched campaigns westward, probing, testing, then striking. And within Babylon itself, the seams began to pull. After centuries of calm, pressure was building. Local governors grew ambitious. Temple elites demanded more. Foreign marriages, once symbols of unity, no longer guaranteed loyalty. The center, held so firmly for so long, began to loosen. Then came the blows. The Elamites struck hard, and they struck deep. They pushed into Kassite lands, sacked cities, and seized symbols of power. Around 1155 BCE, they did what the Hittites once did centuries earlier. They entered Babylon, but this time there would be no quiet return. The Kassite king was taken captive. The temples were plundered. The statue of Marduk, the same god whose image was once rescued and restored, was carried off in chains. It wasn't just a military defeat, it was spiritual decapitation. The gods were gone. The rituals disrupted. The heart of Kassite legitimacy broken. Dur-Kurigalzu, their proud capital, was abandoned. Its canals dried, its walls crumbled, its ziggurat, once a symbol of endurance, now stood alone in the dust. The empire didn't shatter overnight. There were no epic final battles carved into stone, no dramatic last stands recorded by scribes. What happened was slower, and in many ways, sadder. The Kassites didn't fall in flames. They faded, like ink running dry, like a song drifting into silence. Their control unraveled. Regional governors began acting independently. Cities stopped listening to the capital. Records grew sparse. Kassite names disappeared from the king lists. By 1100 BCE, they were gone. No treaty, no final decree, just silence. Some were likely absorbed into the eastern highlands, pushed back into the Zagros from where they had first emerged. Others may have remained in Babylonia as landowners or minor elites, forgotten pieces of a dynasty once central to the land. But their reign had ended. Unlike Mycenae, they left no burned palaces. Unlike Hatti, there were no dramatic letters begging for aid. Their empire didn't collapse with fire. It crumbled with time, because that's the risk of ruling quietly. When the storms come, when the world turns loud, you can be swept away without anyone noticing. It wasn't failure that ended the Kassite dynasty. It was change. They were made for a world that valued calm, cooperation, and continuity. But that world was gone. In its place rose kingdoms built on conquest. Assyria would soon dominate Mesopotamia. New powers would rise in the west. The age of scribes and stewards was giving way to the age of warriors and empire builders. The Kassites couldn't survive that shift, not because they were weak, but because they weren't brutal. In a time of fire, they were a flickering lamp, and when the wind turned, it went out. But they didn't leave behind nothing. They left order, systems. Land laws still copied centuries later. Stability that gave Babylon the chance to rise again, long after they were gone. And though their name faded from memory, buried under layers of louder rulers and grander myths, they held the center of the ancient world longer than anyone else. Not with iron, not with fear, but with time. And time, in the end, remembers more than we think. For centuries, the Kassites were a rumor. a passing name in scattered texts, a placeholder in ancient king lists. No myths, no epics, no legends whispered through time. Just a mystery, wedged between the grandeur of Hammurabi and the rise of Assyria. It wasn't until the soil began to speak that their story resurfaced. In the 20th century, archaeologists turned their tools toward a forgotten site near modern-day Baghdad, an ancient mound known as Akar Kuf. They weren't searching for the Kassites. No one really was. But what they found was Dur-Kurigalzu, the lost capital. Built by kings who had no need to carve their faces into history, but who still left foundations behind. The city's layout came into view: ziggurats, courtyards, canal systems. Not the work of raiders or usurpers, but of planners, of builders, of rulers who took the long view. And at the heart of it, a massive ziggurat, its bricks still bearing inscriptions in cuneiform, naming the Kassite kings who oversaw its rise. They had written their names after all, just not loudly. Even deeper in the dirt, more clues appeared. Kuduru stones, dozens of them, carved with symbols of gods, legal boundaries, and curses for any who broke the terms. Each one a capsule, small but dense. A window into how this quiet empire functioned. They revealed a society where kings granted land to soldiers, priests, and temples. Where law and religion were deeply intertwined. Where governance wasn't about conquest, but about coordination. Through these stones, we saw how they managed loyalty. Not by fear, but by order. We saw how they integrated Babylonian gods alongside their own. How Marduk stood beside Kassite deities like Shukamuna. How their rule didn't erase what came before, but layered itself on top, blending the foreign and the local. These weren't tyrants, they were stewards. But even with these breakthroughs, something was still missing: their voice. The Kassite language remains elusive, not fully translated, not fully understood. It doesn't resemble Akkadian. It doesn't resemble Sumerian. It appears in fragments, glossaries, names, stray words in multilingual texts. A name here, a title there. Like echoes trapped under layers of time. Linguists still debate its roots. Some link it to the Eastern Highlands, others to lost languages further afield. It's as if the Kassites spoke from a hilltop, and history only heard the wind. But even without full translation, their message is clear. They ruled Babylon for nearly 400 years, longer than the Akkadians, longer than the Amorites, longer than the Assyrians ever would. They didn't just hold the throne, they held the system together, and that might be their greatest legacy, because by stabilizing Babylon, they gave rise to what came after. Assyria rose into a superpower only after the Kassite foundations had been laid. Babylon would recover from its sack, and under later rulers, like Nebuchadnezzar, become legendary once more. Even the Persians, centuries later, would adopt Mesopotamian traditions that the Kassites had helped preserve. It's easy to overlook them. They didn't leave us poetry like the Sumerians, didn't burn bright like the Hittites, didn't frighten the world like the Assyrians. But they gave Babylon something no one else did: time. Time to rebuild, time to breathe, time to transition from the old world to the next. And perhaps that's why they vanished so completely. Because they weren't removed from Babylonian culture. They were absorbed into it. By the end of their rule, their names sounded Babylonian. Their titles were Babylonian. Their cities followed Babylonian customs. The distinction blurred until it dissolved. They had become so much a part of the system they preserved that when they disappeared, no one realized they were gone. That's a strange kind of immortality. Not the kind that's sung in heroic verse. Not the kind carved into triumphal arches. But the kind that lingers in the structure of things. In the way land was divided. In the way temples managed grain. In the quiet assumptions baked into the bricks of Babylon. Their story isn't a headline, it's the fine print of empire, and yet, that fine print held together one of the world's oldest civilizations through its darkest century. So when we ask why the Kassites were forgotten, maybe it's because they succeeded too well. They made Babylon function so smoothly, so durably, that their names didn't need to be remembered, only their results. But now, the silence is broken. The ground has spoken, the tablets have surfaced, and the story they tell is one of quiet greatness. The Kassites didn't rule with spectacle, they ruled with stamina, and in doing so, they shaped the course of the ancient world. Even if most of that world forgot their name, they weren't the fiercest, they weren't the loudest, they didn't conquer the known world or carve their triumphs into cliffs. But the Kassites ruled longer than anyone else in Babylon's history. Not by lighting fires, but by keeping the flame alive. While others chased glory in war, they built roads, restored temples, negotiated peace, balanced the books of empire, and they did it not for a decade or even a century, but for 400 years. That's longer than Rome held Britain, longer than the Ottomans ruled Egypt, longer than any modern nation has held uninterrupted power over a major city. And yet, they vanished into silence. No legend, no epic, no monument that tells their tale in full. Why? Maybe because they didn't scream. They didn't demand history's attention. They didn't pose as gods or carve victories into stone. They ruled with patience, not fear. And in the end, it wasn't weakness that made them forgettable. It was restraint. In a world unraveling, they held Babylon steady. They bridged old dynasties with new traditions, kept temples open, kept records flowing, and gave future empires something rare to inherit: order. And for that, they were overlooked. But perhaps memory needs tuning, because history isn't only forged by fire and fanfare, it's also shaped by those who endured quietly, those who preserved the center when the edges fell away. If we want to truly understand what made civilization last, we must look beyond the conquerors. We must learn to hear the stewards too, the ones like the Kassites. Thank you for joining me. If stories like this change how you see the past, subscribe and support me in giving voice to history's quiet giants.